Buddy, first of all, I want to welcome our visitors this morning. And I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here on this beautiful sunny morning, and hope that you can stick around for a little bit afterwards. I want to thank Carl for that song, that not so strange song for the giving, but I always appreciate that song because I was once that poor, fainting seaman, literally, and I'm not using literally figuratively. In an article entitled, "We Have Reached End Stage Polarization," David French argues that Americans are suffering from a severe national sickness. That sickness is that we despise one another. As evidence of this widespread sickness of our American culture, he references a couple of recent surveys, fairly recent surveys. One is a 2025 study by the Pew Research Center of 25 countries across Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America, and asked residents to rate the morality and ethics of their fellow countrymen. The United States was the only country surveyed in which a majority of citizens viewed the morality and ethics of their fellow citizens as either bad or somewhat bad. In all other countries, the people viewed their fellow citizens' morality as either somewhat or very good. And that was true even of countries that were torn by civil strife, like Nigeria and Mexico. Even there, the majority of citizens saw their fellow citizens as good. Additionally, French references a 2022 Pew survey that showed, and I quote, that large shares of Democrats and Republicans thought of each other as closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, and unintelligent. And the measurements were getting worse every year. French concludes that both sides hate each other so much that it's almost meaningless to ask who hates who the most. Well, I apologize for beginning my lesson with such a negative picture. But I think it's fitting for today's passage. We've come now to the final lesson, I believe, if I'm right, the final lesson on the Sermon on the Mount, a series we've been in for some time now. And this brings us to Matthew chapter 7, which begins with the words, "Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you." How do Jesus' words here and the verses that follow it speak or relate to this national sickness that is described in these surveys? How do they relate to how we view and speak about others whose values may differ from ours? How do they relate to ourselves on a more personal level in our relationships with our family members or with those around us? How do we apply these words to those relationships? How do we handle disagreements? How do we handle conflicts? How do we approach others we see acting in certain ways that we think are self-destructive? Obviously, I won't be able to touch on everything in chapter 7. I've been assigned chapter 7, and I won't be able to do justice to it. The title that I was given was Discernment, which I think is very fitting for this chapter. I'm going to focus mostly on the first 12 verses. I think we really need a couple more lessons to finish this chapter up. I'll try to touch on the chapter as a whole as we go through it as well. I've taken my title and the general outline for this lesson from Friedrich Brunner in his commentary on Matthew, the Christ book. And so I've entitled it, "Don't Judge, but Judge a Little. Have Spiritual Discernment." So let's begin. Wrong way. Let's go forward, not backwards. Okay. First of all, verses 1 through 5. Don't judge. So let's read it again and finish it off here. "Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. This is perhaps the most famous passage in the entire Bible. Verse 1, specifically, judge not, lest you be judged. And although you won't see this passage on signs held up at an NFL football game, up in the stands, this is probably more famous than John 3:16. Because even non-Christians not only know it, but are not afraid to quote it against Christians. I won't have time to give these verses justice, no pun intended, but let's see what we can glean from them to help us to be more discerning in our relationships. First, what does it mean not to judge? Or what does it mean to judge? What does that word mean? And what's Jesus forbidding exactly? The word judge itself comes from the Greek word krino, which means to decide, to discern, to evaluate, to choose, things like that. Acts 4 is a good example. It's used many times in the scriptures. Acts 4, when the apostles were arrested and then they were released, and they came before the Jewish rulers, and they said something like, whether it's right for us to obey God or men, you be the judge. You decide. And that's the word they used, krino. It can refer to a value judgment, an appraisal. Jesus parallels it here to the word measure. He says, for with what measure you measure, it will be measured back to you. How you measure or value something. A word literally for weighing or measuring out something. In the Old Testament, in places like Proverbs and the prophets, it often speaks about measuring with integrity. If you're going to measure out some wheat or something to sell somebody something, you need to measure honestly and with integrity and with equity. And so in a sense, Jesus is saying, don't measure and weigh people in a dishonest, biased, inequitable way with unbalanced scales. So what exactly, then, is he forbidding? Are we using these verses correctly when we use them to reject someone else's judgment of us or their critique of our behavior? Is that what Jesus is saying you're never to do? Is to critique each other? Are we not to hold one another and our leaders as well, and public figures, accountable for their actions? Well, you don't have to read very far to see that that's not what Jesus is saying exactly. Right here in this very passage in the Sermon on the Mount, in the very next verse, which I'm going to get into in a little bit, he says, don't give to dogs what is holy. And don't throw your pearls before pigs. Well, that requires a certain amount of judgment. In verse 15, he warns us to beware of the false prophets. Requires some kind of judgment there. Matthew 18, verses 15 to 18, Jesus said, if your brother sins against you, go to him, or her, if it's your sister, alone, and tell them their fault. And if they refuse to hear you, bring 2 or 3 witnesses. And if they refuse to hear them, tell it to the church. And let them be as a tax gatherer and a sinner or something like that. So that requires a certain kind of appraisal, a certain kind of measuring, a certain amount of judgment. So if Jesus is not absolutely forbidding us to critique and judge and hold each other accountable, just what does he mean when he starts out and absolutely forbids judgment? Because it's an imperative. Do not judge. Well, first, I think he's warning us against unfair, as I've kind of already alluded to, unfair and inequitable or dishonest or maybe hypocritical judgment. He says we have to take the log out of our own eye or the plank out of our own eye before we can see to take the speck out of our brother's eye. A perfect example of that would be John chapter 8, when the Pharisees and the lawyers, and they brought this woman who was caught in adultery to Jesus. And it said she was caught in adultery and wanted to see what Jesus would do. And Jesus' response was, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Right? So they were clearly very hypocritical. I mean, where was the man who was caught in adultery? And clearly they were just there to test Jesus. And so it was an unfair judgment and a hypocritical judgment. And so Jesus suggests we better look to our own selves first before we judge another person. That at the very least ought to temper our judgment, shouldn't it? Make us more hesitant to judge, a little more reluctant to judge others. Certainly ought to make us more careful and more measured in our judgments. But Dallas Willard, in his classic spiritual formation book, The Divine Conspiracy, suggests that even that is not quite what Jesus is getting at here. I think it is, but there's another element that Willard brings out. That is, Jesus is saying that once you have some bigger... Jesus is not saying that once you have the big plank out of your eye, now you can go around and take all the specks out of everybody's eyes. I mean, is that really what Jesus is saying is? You got it all together now, go judge everybody else. So I think he makes a good case. Let me quote here. He says, condemnation is the board in our eye. Jesus knows that the mere fact that we are condemning someone shows our heart to not have the kingdom rightness he has been about. Condemnation, especially with its usual accompaniments of anger and contempt and self-righteousness, blinds us to the reality of the other person. We cannot see clearly how to assist our brother because we cannot see our brother. And we will never know how to truly help him until we have grown into the kind of person who does not condemn, period. Getting a board out is not a matter of correcting something that is wrong in our life so that we will be able to condemn our dear ones better or more effectively, so to speak. In other words, the log that's in our eyes is the condemning spirit. So, and the condemning spirit that tries to get the speck out of everybody else's eye. I think he has something there. So whether it's a dishonest judgment, an inequitable judgment, a hypocritical judgment, or an absolute condemning judgment, I think Jesus is forbidding all of that. But I think it goes beyond even all of that. I think Jesus is forbidding a hypercritical judgment. There's a warning here against taking specks out of everyone's eyes. What kind of community would that be if we all went around taking all the little specks out of each other's eyes? I mean, don't we want God judging us generously and with grace? Don't we want God's patience and forgiveness and generosity? And if we do, shouldn't we give that to everybody else? I think what Jesus is asking is that we hold a certain posture towards judging that makes us exceptionally careful and even hesitant about judging. A posture of exceptional generosity towards others, as generous toward others as we would want others to be towards us. Sounds like verse 12. That is exactly verse 12. And I think that's what he was saying back in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Or a little later in chapter 5, when he warns us against despising others and labeling others, or being angry at others. And when he admonishes us to love our enemies and do good to them and pray for them. It's a certain posture that we have towards other people. I like to recommend books while I preach. One I highly recommend is David Brooks' wonderful book, How to Know a Person. I recently listened to it on a 3,000-mile road trip I took over spring break, so I had a lot of listening time. In fact, I listened to it twice. on the way down and on the way back when I went down to Utah. And it was so good, I decided to buy the book and went ahead and ordered it. Wish I'd have read a long time ago. It seems like the entire book was a commentary on Matthew chapter 7, filled with all kinds of examples and had practical application and some funny and interesting stories. In chapter 1, Brooks says, I've come to believe that the quality of our lives and the health of our society depends to a large degree on how well we treat each other in the minute interactions of daily life. And all these different skills rest on one foundational skill, the ability to understand what another person is going through. There is one skill that lies at the heart of every person, family, school, community, organization, or society. The ability to see someone else deeply and make them feel seen. To accurately know another person and to let them feel valued, heard, and understood. That is at the heart of being a good person. The ultimate gift you can give to others and to yourself. Human beings need recognition as much as they need food and water. What a better society it would make if we all did this better. Brooks describes how in every crowd there are diminishers and illuminators. Diminishers are people who make other people feel small and unseen. See other people as things to be used, not as persons to be befriended, who judge others and label others and pigeonhole them into a certain category. Illuminators, on the other hand, have a persistent curiosity about other people and have trained themselves in the craft of understanding others. They ask questions about the other person, shine their care on others, show interest in the other person, help others become better versions of themselves. They listen intently and want to know more. They say things like, tell me more about that. Or, how did you feel? Or, what was it like to fill in the blank? And I love the story he tells of Jenny Jerome, who later became Winston Churchill's mother. And the story goes that she dined with the British statesman William Gladstone, and she left thinking that he was the cleverest person in all of England. And later, she dined with Gladstone's great rival, Benjamin Disraeli, I don't know who that is, and left the dinner thinking she was the cleverest person in all of England. Can you think of people who have made you feel that way? Who have made you feel like you're important, you're the good person? When I thought about this, I immediately thought about Randy Drollinger. For those of you who have only been here a few years, maybe you don't know who I'm talking about. He was a member here who tragically died in a logging accident several years back. And Randy, he was an encourager like nobody I ever knew. You know what I'm talking about. Whenever I talked to Randy, he made me feel like I was the better person. In fact, he would say, if he was introducing himself to somebody and I was standing next to him, he'd say, hi, I'm Randy, but here's the better Randy. And he was like maybe Barnabas, a son of encouragement. How I wish I were more like Randy, that Randy. Discernment is about knowing what to say and when to say it and how to say it. Having wisdom in our relationships and being exceptionally careful in our judgments. So, do not judge, but judge a little. Jesus goes on in verse 6 to say, do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn and attack you. Whew, so if you're not to judge, then what is Jesus saying here? That sounds pretty judgmental to me, to call other people pigs and dogs. It sounds like he's judging a person's worthiness, or he's telling us to judge people's worthiness. But is that really what Jesus is saying? Or could we give it a more positive interpretation, such as, meeting people where they are. In other words, perhaps the onus is on us to ensure that when we try to help others and to get better, that we do so in a way that they will be receptive. For example, by building a relationship first, by building trust with the person first. The old saying goes, don't tell me how much you know until you show me how much you care, or something like that. To soften a person's heart so that they're actually going to be receptive. To approach them in a posture of listening rather than critiquing. To quote Dallas Willard again, he says on this verse 6, our practice of condemnation engineering, as it might be called, usually goes hand in hand with another device mistakenly used to manage the lives of those we truly care about. That is, I'd offer you my coffee, but it probably wouldn't help. That is, the practice of pushing the things of God upon them, whether they want or are ready for them or not. He states further, Jesus states further, I think he said, that Jesus is not saying that we should not give good things and good deeds to people who might reject or misuse them. In fact, he is teaching precisely the opposite. We are not to be like our Father in the heavens, who is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Jesus is not calling other people dogs, and he's not calling other people pigs. He's using a metaphor or an analogy that says something like this. Judging another person whose heart is not open, maybe because you are judging hypocritically or hypercritically, is like throwing what is holy to the dogs. It's like that. You are wasting your time, not necessarily because they are not a worthy subject, but perhaps because we have failed to open the door into their heart. Perhaps because of our own judgmental posture. Perhaps because we are, in Brooks's words, diminishers and not illuminators. So how do we become illuminators? That brings me to the next passage, verses 7 through 11. He says, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Now, we could interpret this passage broadly and think that anything we ask of Jesus, that he's promising, if we would just ask, seek, and knock, he will give it to us. But I think within the context, he's still talking about discernment and judgment. How will we know how much generosity to give in our judgments? Because it may differ in different situations. How will we find the best words to choose in our interactions with other people? How can we become more like illuminators and less like diminishers? Well, pray for wisdom. Pray for discernment before we act. The book of James speaks to this. The book of James is essentially a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe it's an extension of the Sermon on the Mount, an expansion of it. And in James 1:5, James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. Ask, and wisdom will be given to you. Later in James chapter 4, he asks, what's the source of all the quarrels and conflicts among you? He says, it's your prayer life. You are praying with the wrong motives and with a lack of humility. So ask, seek, knock for wisdom. And that can be a dangerous thing. Because if we're trying to deal with a conflict or want to approach somebody that we see is acting in a self-destructive way, which I think is legitimate. We need to pray for wisdom. And that's dangerous because God just might answer and change us. We're the ones maybe who need the changing before we can go and help somebody else to be changed. Finally, in the last part of this section, use your imagination. Use your imagination. The final concluding statement is really a summing up of the whole thing. In verse 12, Jesus says, so, there's the sum up word, or therefore, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So after everything he said about judging and discernment and wisdom in our relationships, here's the summation of it. Whatever you want others to do to you, however you want others to treat you, treat them in the same way. Brunner states it this way: relate in an imaginatively gracious way with others. In other words, imagine how you would want them to judge you, to discern your inner motives, your feelings, your desires. Don't we all wish to be seen, to be recognized, to be understood? Don't we all desire that others would be generous towards us? Don't we all want others to give us the benefit of the doubt? To be patient with us, to be forgiving of our failures, which are many? So Jesus says, do the same towards them. And this is basically what it means to have empathy. To walk in another person's shoes, to put yourself in their place before you judge them. And Jesus isn't teaching anything new here. He says, this is the law and the prophets. And that's been the case through the entire Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is nothing new. He's just drawing upon the law and the prophets. It's what's always been taught in God's Word. And maybe that's even the narrow gate he talks about in the very next verse when he says, enter by the narrow gate. That is, be that illuminator, that rare person who's like Randy Drollinger. To be gracious and generous, who shows real discernment in their judgments. Because that leads to life and flourishing. While being a diminisher and a judger leads to destruction of relationships, of communities, of nations. Well, in conclusion, I feel like we need one or two more lessons on the Sermon on the Mount, but since that's not to be, I don't think, I always like to ask at the end of a series or even at the end of a lesson this question. So what? So what? We spent a few months now on the Sermon on the Mount. So what? What will it change? The Sermon on the Mount is perhaps the most important passage of the entire Bible. It is the essence of Jesus' politics, the manifesto of Jesus' kingdom, and the epitome of what it means to be Jesus' disciple. To be humble and meek, to be merciful and hunger for justice, to be a peacemaker, to not look at others with contempt or anger or label them, but instead to love your enemies and to do good for them and pray for them, to shun self-righteousness and power and greed. It is the kind of spirit that ought to characterize who we are as a people. And it should inform all of our relationships, how we view the world, and even, I hate to say it, our politics. including our decisions on the kinds of political leaders we support. Because as Jesus says in this very passage, you can't get grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles. Will you give in to the sickness of our society and contribute to it, or will we truly be different as a people? Will we heed the words of Jesus and be like the wise man who built his house on the rock of Jesus Christ and his words? Or will we build our house on the sand? Thank you very much for listening. This hasn't been a lesson to tell you how to be saved. But if you're that sailor who is lost and adrift at sea, there's a lighthouse shining. It's Jesus Christ. And he's beaconing you to come to him. And I would urge you to do that as we stand and sing the song that was chosen.